The thunderous crack of gunfire ripped through the quiet dawn, jolting Rowan Zachariah from his sweat-soaked nightmare. His heart hammered against his ribs as he sat upright, pistol drawn before his eyes had fully opened. But there were no intruders in his isolated cabin outside Llano, Texas, just the familiar demons that visited him each night since the war ended in '65. 3 years had passed, yet the nightmares remained as faithful as shadows at dusk. Rowan dragged a trembling hand through his dark hair, now damp with sweat despite the cool March air. The small cabin's walls seemed to close in on him as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the worn curtains. Like every morning after the nightmares, his throat felt raw likely from the screaming that had driven away the last person who tried to help him, the widow Johnson, who'd lasted exactly 3 nights as his housekeeper before declaring him possessed by devils. That had been 5 months ago. Since then, no one from Llano ventured out to his property unless absolutely necessary, and Rowan made the journey into town only when his supplies dwindled to nothing. The residents had taken to calling him Mad Zach behind his back, though none dared say it to his face. Not when he still wore his Colt .45 with the ease of a man who knew how to use it. With a groan, Rowan swung his legs over the edge of his bed, bones aching more than they should for a man of 32. The small mirror above his washbasin reflected a stranger, a once handsome face now weathered by sun and haunted by memories, dark circles permanent beneath piercing blue eyes, and a beard that had grown past respectable into wild. He splashed cold water on his face and set about his morning routine, trying to shake off the lingering images of the nightmare. 2 hours later, he rode into Llano with a list of supplies needed for the next month. The town had grown since he'd first arrived, the railroad bringing new life to what had once been little more than a dusty outpost. Still, it retained the rough-hewn character of most Texas settlements, a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, the courthouse square, saloons doing business at all hours, and the general store where Rowan now tied his horse. "Morning, Mr. Zachariah," said Timothy Gardner, the store owner, with the cautious politeness reserved for potentially dangerous animals. "Been a while since we saw you in town." "Need supplies," Rowan replied, handing over his list without preamble. His voice was gruff from disuse. Timothy nodded and began gathering the items. "Heard you might be needing a new ranch hand soon. Your fence on the south side looked mighty poor when I rode past last week." Rowan frowned. "Don't need help." "Everyone needs help sometimes," came a voice from behind him, clear and melodious, with a slight accent he couldn't place. Rowan turned, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun before he caught himself. A woman stood in the doorway, the morning sun creating a halo around her auburn hair. She was dressed in practical riding clothes, but there was an unmistakable refinement to her bearing. "Miss Layton has just arrived from Boston," Timothy explained, watching Rowan carefully. "She's Dr. Miller's niece, come to help him with his practice." The woman stepped forward, extending a gloved hand. "Ruby Layton, and you are—" Rowan stared at the offered hand as if it might bite him. "Zachariah," he finally said, reluctantly accepting the handshake. Her grip was firmer than he expected. "Rowan Zachariah, Mr. Zachariah, a pleasure." Her green eyes studied him with an unsettling directness. "You look like you haven't slept in days." The blunt observation startled a harsh laugh from him. "Sleep and I aren't on speaking terms, madam." Instead of the usual discomfort his admission caused, Miss Layton merely nodded. "My uncle mentioned there might be someone in town suffering from soldier's heart. I wonder if that's you." Rowan's jaw tightened. "Don't need a doctor poking at me." "Perhaps not. But my uncle specializes in ailments of the mind as well as the body." He worked with many soldiers after the war. There's nothing wrong with my mind that time won't fix. The lie tasted bitter on his tongue. Ruby Layton's expression remained composed, but her eyes softened. Time is a poor doctor when left to work alone, Mr. Zachariah. She reached into her bag and withdrew a small book. My uncle asked me to deliver this to you should we meet. Good day. She placed the book on the counter and left before Rowan could object. He stared after her, bewildered by the encounter. That'll be $8.45, Timothy said, pulling Rowan back to the present. Rowan paid and gathered his supplies, pointedly leaving the book on the counter. But as he reached the door, curiosity got the better of him. He returned, snatched up the slim volume and stuffed it into his saddlebag. The ride back to his ranch was uneventful, but Rowan couldn't shake the memory of Ruby Layton's direct gaze or her unexpected words. At his cabin, he unpacked his supplies and finally examined the book she'd given him. On the Nature of Sleep and Its Disturbances by Dr. James Miller. He almost threw it into the fire, but something stopped him, perhaps the fact that someone had thought of him at all. That night, like every night, the nightmares came. He was back at Shiloh, the air thick with gun smoke and the screams of dying men. But this time, something was different. As he bolted upright in bed, pistol drawn, he realized he wasn't alone. Ruby Layton stood in his doorway, a lantern in her hand, her face calm despite the gun pointed at her heart. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Rowan demanded, lowering his weapon with a shaking hand. "Your ranch hand fetched me," she said simply. "Mr. Vega, he's been worried about you. Miguel has no right. He said you haven't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in months, that your screaming frightens the horses." She set the lantern down on his small table. "My uncle sent me with something that might help." Rowan noticed then that she carried a small medical bag. "I don't want laudanum or morphine. Seen too many men lose themselves to that. Good, because I wouldn't offer it." She opened her bag and removed a small tin. "This is a tea blend my grandmother used. Valerian root, chamomile, and other herbs. It won't stop the dreams, but it might make them less vivid." Rowan eyed the tin suspiciously. "Why are you doing this?" Ruby sat in the chair across from his bed, seemingly unbothered by the impropriety of being in a man's bedroom at night. "Because I've seen what war does to men. My brother came back from Antietam a different person." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of her bag. "He took his own life 6 months later." The admission hung in the air between them. Rowan felt a twinge of guilt for his hostility. "I'm sorry about your brother," he said finally. "As am I, which is why I studied with my uncle after that. I wanted to understand." She stood and moved to his small stove. "May I prepare the tea?" Too exhausted to argue further, Rowan nodded. As Ruby worked, he studied her by the lantern light. In the soft glow, her features were gentler, but no less determined. Her movements were efficient and practiced, speaking of a woman who knew her own mind. "How old are you, Miss Layton?" he asked suddenly. She glanced up, a hint of amusement in her eyes. 26, Mr. Zachariah." "Old enough to know my own mind and young enough to still believe in possibilities." She handed him a steaming cup. "Drink this, all of it." The tea was bitter but not unpleasant. As he drank, Ruby settled back in the chair, her eyes never leaving his face. "I'll stay until you fall asleep," she said. "That's not proper," Rowan objected weakly. "Neither are nightmares, yet they come uninvited." She took the empty cup from him. "Lie down, Mr. Zachariah." To his own surprise, Rowan complied. The tea spread warmth through his limbs, and a heaviness began to settle over him. "Why aren't you afraid?" he murmured, fighting to keep his eyes open. "Everyone else is." Ruby's smile was sad in the lantern light. "Because I know the difference between a dangerous man and a wounded one." Those were the last words Rowan heard before sleep claimed him, deeper and more peaceful than he had known in years. Morning came with the unfamiliar sensation of restfulness. Rowan opened his eyes to find his cabin empty, no sign of Ruby Layton save for the tin of tea on his table and a note. Steep for 5 minutes. Drink 1 hour before sleep. RL. For 3 nights, Rowan followed her instructions, and for 3 nights, he slept better than he had since the war. The nightmares didn't vanish, but they loosened their grip, becoming less vivid, less consuming. On the 4th day, he did something he hadn't done in months. He shaved his beard, trimmed his hair, and rode into town not out of necessity but with purpose. Dr. Miller's practice occupied a modest building near the courthouse. Rowan hesitated outside, hat in hand, before summoning the courage to enter. A small bell announced his arrival, and moments later, Ruby appeared from a back room. Surprise flickered across her face before she schooled her features. "Mr. Zachariah, this is unexpected. Came to thank you," he said, turning his hat in his hands. "The tea helps. I'm glad to hear it." She studied his face, noting the changes. "You look more rested. Feel it, too." He cleared his throat. "Also wanted to apologize for pointing my gun at you. Wasn't right." Ruby's expression softened. "You weren't fully awake. I should have announced myself better." An awkward silence fell between them. Finally, Rowan asked, "Your uncle around? Thought I might speak with him. He's making house calls today, but he'll be back tomorrow if you'd like to return." She hesitated, then added, "Or we could discuss your case. I assist him with all his patience." Rowan's instinct was to refuse, to retreat to the safety of his isolation, but something in Ruby's steady gaze made him reconsider. "All right," he said finally, "but not here. Too many ears in town." Ruby nodded, understanding his need for privacy. "I finish here at 4. I could ride out to your ranch then." "I'll escort you," Rowan said, his tone making it clear this wasn't negotiable. That evening, as they rode side by side toward his property, Rowan found himself speaking more than he had in months. He told Ruby about his ranch, the 30 acres he'd purchased after the war, the small herd of cattle he was building, and his plans to expand once the railroad connection was complete. "It's beautiful land," Ruby observed as they crested a hill overlooking his property. The setting sun bathed the landscape in golden light, highlighting the rolling hills and the creek that cut through the eastern edge of his land. "Peaceful. That's why I chose it," Rowan admitted. "Needed quiet after everything." At his cabin, Rowan prepared a simple meal while Ruby explored his modest living space. She paused at his bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of well-worn volumes. "You're a reader," she said, surprise coloring her voice. "Was a schoolteacher before the war," Rowan said, stirring the pot of stew. "In Tennessee." Ruby turned to him, reassessing. "You never mentioned that." "Don't mention a lot of things." He motioned toward the table. "Food's ready, such as it is." Over the simple meal, Ruby asked careful questions about his nightmares when they began, their frequency, their content. Rowan answered haltingly at first, then with increasing openness as Ruby's clinical approach made the conversation less daunting. "You know what triggers them?" she asked. Rowan considered. "Sometimes sudden noises, gunshots, obviously, thunderstorms, sometimes nothing at all," Ruby nodded. "That's common. The mind stores these memories differently than ordinary ones. They can surface without warning." She sipped her coffee. "My uncle believes these memories need to be processed while awake, not just revisited in dreams." "Meaning?" "Talk about them, write about them, face them in daylight so they hold less power at night," Rowan scoffed. "Talking won't change what happened." "No," Ruby agreed. "But it might change how those memories affect you now." After dinner, they sat on his porch, watching darkness settle over the land. The night air carried the scent of spring, of new beginnings. Rowan found himself sharing more about his experiences, not the worst of the war, not yet, but smaller moments. The camaraderie among his unit, the letters from home, the brief reprieves between battles. When it grew too dark to see more than silhouettes, Ruby rose to leave. "I should return before my uncle worries." "I'll ride with you," Rowan said, standing. "There's no need, it's not safe for a woman to ride alone at night." His tone brooked no argument. The ride back to town was quieter, both of them wrapped in their thoughts. At the edge of Lanneau, where the road widened and the first buildings appeared, Ruby finally broke the silence. "Will you come see my uncle tomorrow?" Rowan hesitated. "Not sure I'm ready for that." Ruby studied him in the moonlight. "Will you permit me to continue visiting you then?" "To help with the nightmares." "People will talk," Rowan warned. "People always talk," Ruby replied with a small smile. "It's what they do best in small towns. It's your reputation at stake." "My reputation can withstand professional visits to a patient." She straightened in her saddle. "Unless you're concerned about yours." That startled a genuine laugh from Rowan. "Mine's already beyond salvaging, Miss Layton." "Ruby," she corrected. "If we're to work together on your health, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Ruby," he repeated, the name feeling strange yet right on his tongue. "Then I'm Rowan." At her uncle's house, Rowan waited until Ruby was safely inside before turning his horse toward home. For the first time in years, he rode through the darkness without feeling its weight pressing down on him. Over the next weeks, Ruby visited Rowan's ranch every few days, always arriving in late afternoon and leaving before true night fell. They established a routine. Ruby would bring new tea blends or books from her uncle's library, and Rowan would provide simple meals. After eating, they would talk about his nightmares at first, then gradually about their lives before and after the war. Rowan learned that Ruby had trained as a nurse during the conflict, working in a Washington hospital where the worst cases came. Her experiences there had led her to study medicine under her uncle's guidance, though women weren't formally admitted to medical schools. She had a gift for healing, and an unconventional approach that combined traditional medicine with folk remedies she'd learned from her grandmother. In turn, Ruby discovered that beneath Rowan's gruff exterior lay a thoughtful man who had once loved teaching children, who could recite Shakespeare from memory, and who dreamed of someday raising horses instead of cattle. She also witnessed firsthand the toll the war had taken on him when, during one of her visits, a neighbor's hunting rifle triggered a violent episode that left Rowan shaking and unable to speak for nearly an hour. Instead of fleeing as others had, Ruby sat beside him, her voice calm as she talked him through the worst of it. "You're in Texas," she reminded him steadily. "On your ranch. The war is over. You're safe, Rowan. No one is going to harm you." When he finally regained his composure, shame washed over him. "Now you see why folks call me mad," he said bitterly. "I see a man who survived terrible things," Ruby corrected. "There's no madness in that." In early April, nearly a month after their first meeting, Rowan rode into town with a purpose beyond supplies. He'd made a decision during the long, quiet hours of the previous night. It was time to see Dr. Miller. The doctor was a slender man with kind eyes and the same direct manner as his niece. He listened without interruption as Rowan haltingly described his symptoms: the nightmares, the sudden returns to the battlefield, the inability to tolerate crowds or loud noises. "Ruby has been telling me about your progress," Dr. Miller said when Rowan finished. "She believes you're ready to try something beyond the teas and talking." "What did you have in mind?" Rowan asked cautiously. "A method I developed working with soldiers after Gettysburg. It involves facing your triggers in measured doses, under controlled circumstances. He leaned forward, hands clasped. It won't be easy, Mr. Zachariah. In fact, it will be quite difficult, but I've seen remarkable results. Rowan considered this. Will Ruby be involved? Dr. Miller smiled slightly. She insisted on it, actually. Says you've built a rapport that would be valuable to the treatment. That evening, Rowan invited both Dr. Miller and Ruby to dinner at the one proper restaurant in Leno. The other diners watched with undisguised curiosity as Mad Zach shared a meal with the doctor and his niece, conversing like ordinary folks. You realize you've just set the town gossips ablaze, Ruby murmured as they left the restaurant. Let them talk, Rowan replied. I'm tired of hiding. The treatment Dr. Miller prescribed was indeed difficult. 3 times a week, Rowan would come to town for sessions that deliberately exposed him to his triggers, first in conversation, then through carefully orchestrated experiences. Ruby was always present, her steady presence an anchor when memories threatened to overwhelm him. By mid-May, Rowan had made significant progress. The nightmares came less frequently, and when they did, they no longer left him disoriented for hours afterward. He began sleeping through most nights, waking rested instead of exhausted. His ranch benefited from his renewed energy. Fences were mended, the cattle tended properly, and he even hired 2 steady hands to help with the expanding work. His relationship with Ruby evolved as well. What had begun as a professional connection deepened into friendship, and from there, into something neither of them named but both increasingly recognized. It revealed itself in small moments: the brush of hands when passing a book, lingering glances across the dinner table, conversations that stretched long into the evening. In late May, Dr. Miller was called away to San Antonio for a medical conference, leaving Ruby to manage his practice. The night before he left, he took Rowan aside. My niece tells me you haven't had a severe episode in over 2 weeks, he said. That's right, Rowan confirmed. Still have bad moments, but nothing like before. Dr. Miller nodded thoughtfully. Ruby believes you're ready for the next phase of treatment. Which is facing a night alone with her present. Rowan stiffened. That wouldn't be proper, Doctor. Propriety be damned, Dr. Miller said with surprising vehemence. I'm talking about healing, not social conventions. Ruby believes that if she's present during your sleep, it might interrupt the cycle of nightmares entirely. And you agree with this? Treatment? Dr. Miller's expression turned shrewd. I think we both know this has moved beyond merely professional concern, Mr. Zachariah. My niece cares for you, and unless I'm mistaken, you care for her as well. Rowan couldn't deny it. She deserves better than a broken man. Perhaps you should let her decide what she deserves. Dr. Miller clapped him on the shoulder. I'll be gone for a week. What happens in that time is between you and Ruby. The night after Dr. Miller's departure, Ruby arrived at Rowan's ranch with her medical bag and a small valise. I've told Mrs. Peterson I'm tending to a patient overnight, she said, referring to the widow who rented her a room in town. She didn't ask questions. The whole town will be talking by morning, Rowan warned, taking her bags. Ruby's smile was unconcerned. Let them. I know what we're doing, even if they don't. That night, after a simple dinner, Ruby prepared the special tea blend that had become part of Rowan's nightly ritual. As he drank, they sat before the fire, talking quietly about inconsequential matters: the spring weather, the new foal born to his mare, the book Ruby was currently reading. When it came time to sleep, Rowan offered Ruby his bed while he took a blanket to the floor. That's not necessary, Ruby said. The bed is large enough for both of us, and I need to be close enough to wake you if the nightmares begin. Rowan swallowed hard. Ruby, this is medical treatment, Rowan, she said firmly, though her cheeks flushed slightly. Nothing more. They lay side by side in the darkness, a respectful distance between them, both acutely aware of the other's presence. Rowan stared at the ceiling, certain sleep would elude him entirely with Ruby so near. But the tea did its work, and eventually his eyes grew heavy. "Sleep," Ruby whispered beside him. "I'll be here." For the first time in 3 years, Rowan slept through the entire night without a single nightmare. He woke to find Ruby already up, preparing breakfast at his stove, her hair loose around her shoulders in the morning light. The sight struck him with such unexpected longing that he had to look away. "Good morning," Ruby said, turning with a smile. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I can remember," Rowan admitted, sitting up. "No dreams at all." Ruby's smile widened. "That's wonderful progress." She brought him a cup of coffee. "Though one good night doesn't mean we've solved everything." "No," Rowan agreed, accepting the cup. Their fingers brushed, and neither pulled away immediately. "But it's a start." For the next 3 nights, Ruby stayed at Rowan's ranch, maintaining the pretense of medical treatment even as both recognized the shifting nature of their relationship. Each night, Rowan slept better than the last. Each morning they found it harder to maintain professional distance. On the 4th night, a violent spring storm rolled in from the west. The thunder shook the small cabin, and lightning illuminated the room in harsh flashes. Conditions that would normally trigger Rowan's worst episodes. Yet with Ruby beside him, her hand occasionally finding his in the darkness when the thunder was loudest, Rowan remained present, anchored by her touch and voice as she spoke quietly about her childhood in Boston, her dreams of becoming a doctor, her love of the wilder Texas landscape. "I never thought I'd stay in Llano," she confessed as rain lashed the windows. "I came to help my uncle temporarily, intending to return east eventually." "And now?" Rowan asked, his voice low in the darkness. Ruby was silent for a long moment. "Now I find reasons to stay," she finally said. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face as she turned toward him. In that brief moment, Rowan saw everything she wasn't saying: her feelings for him, her uncertainty about the future, her hope. When the next crash of thunder came, Rowan barely noticed it. His attention was entirely on Ruby as she shifted closer, her hand finding his again, fingers intertwining. "Ruby," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Sh," she whispered, moving closer still until her head rested against his shoulder. "Just sleep. We'll talk in the morning." But sleep was the furthest thing from Rowan's mind as Ruby's warmth pressed against him, her breath soft against his neck. With a gentle hand, he tilted her face up toward his. In the next flash of lightning, he saw her eyes, wide and unafraid. "I'm falling in love with you," he said simply. "And it terrifies me more than any nightmare." Ruby's hand came up to touch his cheek, fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Why does it frighten you?" "Because I'm still broken. Because you deserve someone whole." "No one is truly whole, Rowan," Ruby said softly. "We're all carrying damages and scars. What matters is whether we let them define us." Another flash of lightning, another rumble of thunder, but Rowan barely registered them. All he could see was Ruby. All he could feel was the gentle touch of her hand on his face. "I love you," she whispered. "Not despite your scars, but including them. They're part of who you are." The admission broke something open inside Rowan, not violently, but gently, like spring ice cracking on a river. He lowered his head and kissed her, tentatively at first, then with growing certainty as Ruby responded, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, the storm outside seemed to have receded, or perhaps they had simply ceased to notice it. "Stay with me," Rowan said, the words both a request and a promise. "Not just tonight." Ruby's answer was to kiss him again, her body pressing closer, all pretense of professional distance abandoned. That night they didn't sleep much. but not because of nightmares. They talked for hours, planning a future neither had dared imagine weeks earlier. When dawn broke, they were still awake, watching the sun rise together from Rowan's porch, Ruby wrapped in his arms. What will the town say? Rowan wondered aloud as they watched the landscape emerge from darkness. Ruby laughed softly. They'll say that Mad Zach finally found someone as crazy as himself. Rowan smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Maybe they're right. Dr. Miller returned from San Antonio a few days later to find his niece had moved most of her belongings to Rowan's ranch. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. Instead, he invited them both to dinner and raised a glass to their happiness. I had hoped my treatment would help you sleep better, he told Rowan with a twinkle in his eye. I didn't necessarily anticipate it would result in acquiring a nephew-in-law. Uncle, Ruby protested, blushing. What, am I presuming too much? Dr. Miller asked innocently. Rowan cleared his throat. Actually, sir, I've asked Ruby to marry me. She's accepted. Dr. Miller's smile was warm. Then my congratulations are in order. When will the wedding be? Next month, Ruby said. A small ceremony, just close friends. And where will you live? I assume Ruby won't be continuing as my assistant. Rowan and Ruby exchanged glances. We've decided to stay at the ranch, Rowan explained. But Ruby plans to establish her own practice there, for the outlying farms and ranches. Dr. Miller nodded approvingly. An excellent solution. The community needs more medical care, especially with the railroad bringing new settlers. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Llano. Reactions were mixed. Some expressed concern for Ruby's welfare, while others suggested Rowan was using her for her medical knowledge. But just as many offered genuine congratulations, especially those who had noticed Rowan's transformation over recent months. Timothy Gardner at the general store was among the first to voice his support. Never seen a man change so completely, he told Ruby when she came in for supplies. Used to fear for my life when he entered my store. Now he actually smiles occasionally. He was never dangerous, Ruby corrected gently. Just hurting. Well, whatever you did, it worked, Timothy replied, and the town's better for it. The wedding took place on a perfect June day with the ceremony held in Dr. Miller's garden. Only 20 guests attended, including Rowan's ranch hands, a few of Dr. Miller's colleagues, and the handful of townspeople who had supported their relationship. Ruby wore a simple cream dress with wildflowers in her hair, while Rowan cleaned up impressively in a new black suit. As they exchanged vows, Rowan found himself marveling at the journey that had brought him here from the depths of solitary suffering to the promise of a shared future with the woman who had faced his darkness without fear. I promise to be your shelter in storms, he told Ruby, his voice steady despite the emotion tightening his throat. As you have been mine. Ruby's eyes shone as she responded, and I promise to stand beside you through darkness and light, to face whatever comes together. Their first months of marriage brought challenges as any new union would, but they were equipped to face them together. Ruby established her medical practice in a small building Rowan constructed near their cabin, serving patients from nearby ranches and farms who couldn't easily travel to town. Rowan continued expanding his ranch, now focusing on horses as he'd always dreamed, with the cattle business providing steady income meanwhile. The nightmares didn't disappear entirely, but they became rare events rather than nightly terrors. On the occasions when Rowan woke shouting, Ruby was there, her calm presence guiding him back to the present. And increasingly, there were nights when he slept peacefully from dusk until dawn, Ruby curled against him. By their first anniversary, they had established a reputation as an unconventional but respected couple. Dr. Miller joined their celebration, bringing news that he intended to retire within the next year, and suggesting that Ruby might consider taking over his practice in town. "I've been thinking about that," Ruby admitted as they sat on their porch after dinner. "With the railroad bringing more people, Leno needs a proper medical clinic, not just a doctor's office." Rowan considered this. "You're thinking bigger than just taking over your uncle's practice." Ruby nodded, excitement lighting her features. "A small hospital. Nothing grand, but something to serve the growing community, with a wing dedicated to treating soldiers and others suffering as you did." "That's ambitious," Rowan said, but his tone was admiring. "Where would you build it?" "That's what I wanted to discuss with you." Ruby took his hand. "We own enough land. We could build it here on the ranch with a road connecting directly to town." Rowan was quiet for a moment, considering. 3 years earlier, the idea of opening his private sanctuary to others would have been unthinkable. Now, it felt right away to transform his place of healing into something that could help others. "I think it's a fine idea," he said finally, "but there's something else we should consider first." Ruby raised an eyebrow. "What's that?" Rowan smiled, squeezing her hand. "The cabin will be getting crowded soon with the baby coming. We should build our new home before turning our attention to a hospital." Ruby's eyes widened. "How did you know? I only confirmed it myself yesterday." "You've been drinking ginger tea instead of coffee," Rowan said, grinning. "And you fell asleep at your desk twice this week. Didn't take a medical degree to figure it out." Ruby laughed, throwing her arms around his neck. "And how do you feel about it?" Rowan held her close, his heart fuller than he'd ever imagined possible. "Terrified, ecstatic, grateful." He pulled back to look into her eyes. "Mostly grateful for you, for everything." Their son, James Miller Zachariah, was born the following winter, a healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. By then, construction had begun on their new home, a spacious 2-story house with plenty of room for the family they hoped to build together. As Leno continued to grow, so did the Zachariah ranch. By the time James was walking, Ruby's small hospital was operational, with 2 additional doctors and 3 nurses on staff. They specialized in treating both physical ailments and what Ruby now openly called battle mind, the condition that had once kept Rowan isolated from the world. Word spread about Dr. Ruby Zachariah's success with troubled veterans, bringing patients from as far away as Dallas and San Antonio. Many stayed at the ranch during their treatment, working with the horses as part of their recovery, a therapy Rowan had developed based on his own experiences. In the spring of 1873, 5 years after Ruby had first appeared in Timothy Gardner's store, the Zachariahs welcomed their second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth, after Rowan's mother. By then, Mad Zach was a nickname remembered by only the oldest residents of Leno, replaced by Doc Zach, though this referred to Ruby or simply the Zachariahs, meaning the family and their growing medical complex. On the night of Elizabeth's birth, after the midwife had gone and Ruby was resting with their daughter, Rowan stood by the window of their bedroom, looking out at the ranch that had transformed from a hiding place into a sanctuary for healing. "What are you thinking about?" Ruby asked softly from the bed. Rowan turned, taking in the sight of his wife holding their newborn daughter, their 3-year-old son sleeping in a trundle beside them. "I was thinking about nightmares," he admitted. Ruby's expression grew concerned. "Have they returned?" "No," Rowan said, moving to sit beside her on the bed. "I was thinking about how they kept everyone away until you stayed through the darkness without fear." He touched Elizabeth's tiny hand. "How different everything would be if you hadn't." "I knew from the moment I saw you that you weren't dangerous," Ruby said, leaning against him. "Just lost, needing someone to guide you home." You did more than guide me, Rowan said, his voice thick with emotion. You gave me a home. As if in agreement, Elizabeth made a small sound in her sleep, her tiny fingers curling around her father's thumb. Outside, the Texas night was calm and clear, stars visible through the window. Rowan felt the familiar peace that now defined his evenings, the quiet certainty that whatever dreams might come, he would never face them alone again. "I love you, Ruby Zachariah," he whispered, pressing a kiss to his wife's temple. "And I love you," she replied, her eyes already heavy with well-earned rest. "Now and always." That night, as his family slept around him, Rowan dreamed not of battlefields and lost comrades, but of the future stretching before them, bright, hopeful, and free from the shadows that had once defined him. In the morning, he woke refreshed, ready to embrace another day of the life he'd never dared imagine possible, a life built with the woman who had faced his darkness without fear and helped him find his way back to the light. Years later, when their children were grown and the Zachariah Medical Center had become one of the most respected institutions in Central Texas for the treatment of both physical and mental afflictions, Rowan and Ruby would still sit together on their porch each evening, watching the sunset over the land they had transformed together. Sometimes they spoke of the early days of nightmares and healing, of courage and love, but more often, they simply sat in companionable silence, hands intertwined, grateful for the journey that had brought them together and the life they had built from what once seemed like irreparable brokenness. And if occasionally Rowan still woke in the darkness, momentarily disoriented by echoes of old dreams, Ruby was always there, her presence an immediate reminder that he was home, he was loved, and the darkness held no power over him anymore.